All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Seamus Demeray. I'm a sales tech here at Nagios Enterprises. I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation on network monitoring with Nagios. This will be a higher level introduction to network monitoring with a few different Nagios solutions. Because network monitoring is kind of a complicated subject, this webinar is a bit unique, where instead of covering just a single solution, we'll actually cover several solutions and how they relate to network monitoring specifically, all from the context of a single HP ProCurve switch that we've got running in our environment. The presentation should last 35 to 45 minutes, and then after we're done with the presentation, we'll leave plenty of time for a live Q&A session. During the presentation, audio feeds from you guys are going to be muted, but that doesn't mean I don't want to hear from you. If you do have any questions as we go along, go ahead and put those into the chat or the questions section of the Q&A. And after the session, like I said, we'll leave plenty of time to cover all those questions for you and answer anything that might have come up as we go along. So just type those in and we'll clear those up at the end. Finally, we are going to be recording today's presentation so it can be made available to others online in the future. And so with that being said, let's jump over to our agenda slide. Today we're going to be going over a few different solutions, as I'd said. We'll talk about the basics of network monitoring and how each of the solutions you see here on the slide serves a specific purpose to give you complete network monitoring, kind of a holistic perspective on your network health. Nagios XI is going to basically monitor states and help us visualize status information. Nagios Log Server is going to monitor logs and help us visualize that information, and both will help us alert on those events as well. And then Nagios Network Analyzer is going to help us monitor net flows, and that could be NetFlow, SFlow, JFlow, IPFix, and then visualize and alert on all that information. And then we'll talk about tying all of those solutions together so that they create one cohesive network monitoring solution. So every device in your network is connected, as you know, and they all communicate with one another as well as with assets internally and external assets and other external items that you may not have any control over. All those connections are carried by the various network devices in your environment. Familiar examples would be things like routers and switches and firewalls. Now, all of those need to be monitored to ensure that a healthy network stays healthy, of course. The process can be kind of involved and complicated, but we've developed a pretty cohesive set of solutions to help monitoring all those stay pretty simple and efficient. And so the first one that we're going to talk about is Nagios XI. And Nagios XI is responsible for periodically checking on the status of remote devices. XI is going to monitor whether a network device is up or down, the throughput on various interfaces, the status of those interfaces. And with the status of those devices being monitored, we won't have to be concerned with unexpected interface outages or throughput breaches. After XI, we'll talk about Log Server. And Log Server is responsible for, like I said, collecting the logs. It'll allow us to archive them, to query them, to visualize them, to alert on them. And then the final one we'll talk about is going to be Nagios Network Analyzer. And of course, that's going to monitor the net flow information of all the network devices and give you things like IP origin and destination data, packet counts, ports that were leveraged, and things like that. And so, as I said at the beginning, in this presentation, we'll focus on a single switch, and this will give you a good idea of how easy the whole process is, monitoring that switch from so many different perspectives with the various solutions. And the switch we'll be using is an HP ProCurve 1810G, and the first solution that we'll look at in depth is Nagios XI. And so, like I said, Nagios XI is going to monitor the device itself, whether the device is up or down. It'll do a check ICMP ping, and it's going to monitor each interface to tell you whether that interface is up or down. It'll monitor bandwidth in and out, and so it'll give you basic health metrics on that particular device. So you've got your Nagios XI server, you've got the various assets that you're monitoring. In this case, it would be a switch or a router that you're monitoring. And then XI will, based on the health checks it does, send out alerts and provide visualizations of the health of those various items. And so we're just going to jump right into the XI demo machine here. And when we first log in, we've got our notices pop up, letting us know about various unhandled host and service problems. And real quickly, just in case you're not familiar with the terminology, in Nagios, a host would be anything with an IP or a URL, like a switch, a router, a firewall. And then a service would be something you're monitoring on that particular host, like interface bandwidth or up-down or CPU check or the ping check. And so that's kind of the difference between hosts and services. Configuring monitoring of a switch or a router is very easy in XI. We're going to go up to our configure menu and go to our configuration wizards. And we'll do a quick filter for network. And we've got our network switch and router wizard. So the first thing we'll talk about is actually configuring monitoring of this. And so we'll punch in our IP here. So .5.41, use the default port of 161. It does support SNMP v1, 2, and 3. This will be an SNMP v2 device. And we'll punch in our community string. And then we're going to monitor using port number, but you can also monitor using port name. We'll leave this checked to actually scan and auto-detect all of the interfaces that are administratively up. And we'll leave the default values for input and output warning and critical and the default port speed, but these can be modified in advance of doing the scan as well. We'll click Next, and what this is going to do, as it says, is just a quick scan of .41 to bring back all the interfaces that are administratively up. And so it'll take just a second as it reaches out, and voila, we've got a nice list of all those interfaces. We can give them a custom service description if we like. We can decide which interfaces that we want to monitor, and we, of course, would probably want to do that ICMP ping check, just to check for things like can it be pinged, is there any packet loss, and things like that between our Nagios server and the device. We can also define a custom warning and critical RAID in and RAID out, and whether it's bytes, kilobytes, megabytes, or gigabytes for the actual interface bandwidth checks. And once we've configured all of that, we just go Next. And real quickly, I'll go through these, but we won't spend too much time here. The regular webinars for each of these solutions are going to go in a lot more depth about all the steps and all the other items that kind of orbit setting up basic monitoring in the solutions. But real quickly, we're just determining how often we want to check this. We're determining if we want to maybe recheck it a few times when a problem is found to make sure it persists before we send an alert, which is a nice little piece of logic to help us avoid flood of false positives, and then people start to ignore alerts and get alert blindness, and then we'll just defeat the purpose of monitoring in the first place. What happens when the problem is detected? We can have the system keep resending alerts periodically if the problem persists for X amount of minutes, who the alerts would go to, and then host groups, logical groups of hosts that allow us to quickly filter and report on specific subsets of our items. So this, of course, would go in our switches host group. We've got service groups and then parent-child relationships, which tell Nagios how everything interrelates from the perspective of the Nagios process. And I will jump real quickly over to the hypermap just to show you that. This is the network topography diagram that you would get as a result of the parent-child relationships that you define inside a Nagios XI. And I wanted you to see this real quick just so you know that you can get a topography diagram and you can actually see how everything interrelates from the perspective of Nagios. So those parent-child relationships not only provide this network topography diagram, a quick visual reference of how everything interrelates and what their statuses are, but Nagios will also alert intelligently based on these relationships. So if the office backbone went into a critical state and Nagios wasn't able to route through it, instead of saying everything beyond this was a warning or critical, Nagios would alert on those items as unreachable because it knows that it can't route to them, and so it doesn't want to send you a flood of alerts for items that it can't get to and make you think they're critical when in fact they may be working perfectly. Nagios just can't check them. And so that's the significance of those parent-child relationships. Once we've configured monitoring of the network device in Nagios XI, we can go over to reports and visualize that data. And so there's a few different reports that we could look at. The first one that we'll look at is bandwidth usage. And so in this report, we can select any interface that we're monitoring and drill down to that particular interface. And we can see daily, weekly, monthly, and annual traffic for that interface. In blue, we've got traffic in. In green, we've got traffic out. And if we scroll down a little bit, we've got annual totals. We can actually look at the whole yearly total of in, out, max, and sum. We can look at monthly breakdowns in this particular column. And then if we click through, we can actually look at daily in, out, max, and sum for this interface. So on a per interface basis, we can very easily graph this data. Another place that we could go for a more customizable graph. So the bandwidth report would, I guess, be focused more on giving you kind of an aggregated look. And then with this report, you could export it as a PDF or a JPEG. You could export a CSV if you wanted some raw numerical data. You could schedule it for delivery. You could email it. So it gives you a nice bird's eye view of how it was performing very recently and in aggregate over a long period of time. But you can also look at the regular graphs of each individual one. And we'll filter for .41 here. And we've got port 1 bandwidth here. We'll just drill down a little bit and look at a graph of that. And so here's the regular port 1 bandwidth. If we click through on our title here, we get to a secondary page where we can really customize the time frame, even to a period of hours if you wanted to. So let's say we wanted to look at a month's worth of data. We could just do that. And now we've got for each interface in and out for a month. And on these graphs, another cool thing I'll note is that we can overlay our warning and critical thresholds and see that bandwidth in has actually been pretty steadily exceeding our threshold. So that's another way to kind of get a perspective and create a graph visualization of that bandwidth data. There's also tools like capacity planning built into Nagios XI if you wanted to project future usage based on that collected historical data. So we'll focus on port 1 bandwidth on this HP Pro curve again. And let's say we wanted to look 3 months into the future. We'll leave the extrapolation method at Holt Winters, but note that there are other options here. And we'll run it. And so here we can look at in and out for port 1 over, and basically what it's going to do is in blue it's showing us data the system has collected. So the observed portion, this is actually data that is based on check. So this is real world data. In gray, it's showing us what it predicts is likely to happen in the next 90 days based on that incoming data, based on the crunching the numbers on the data that's already been collected, the real world data. We can see that we're trending up for bandwidth in. If we overlay our warning and critical, we can see that we are trending up, and although we're probably not going to hit our critical threshold in the next 90 days, there's a very good chance that we are going to exceed our warning for bandwidth in on port 1 sometime in the next 90 days, so that's worth taking a look at. Out for port bandwidth, we can overlay our warning and critical and see that as far as traffic out, we really shouldn't exceed those thresholds. So you've got the bandwidth usage report, you can run capacity planning, you could look at the individual graphs, and there's also other reports you could leverage, things like the notifications, the alert histogram, and then we could just limit this down to a particular host. We'll look just at .41, we'll look at perhaps this year, and then run our report. And it'll show us all of the various notifications that were generated for this particular host, this particular HP Pro Curve switch. So XI is really good at monitoring, as you can see, the device itself, doing a ping check, checking things like onboard CPUs, checking things like interfaces for up, down, and bandwidth in, out. XI can monitor pretty much anything that uses electricity with a couple of notable exceptions, and those exceptions would be things like logs and flow data. Those are really the two exceptions to what XI can really keep track of. And so to fill in those gaps, we'll take a look at a couple of other solutions. And like I said, we're going to move pretty quick. There's a lot to see in the XI interface. The dashboards, the views, the multi-tenancy, the administrative and backup and configuration options. But for this one, we're just going to real quick show you, as I did, how to monitor a network device, how to monitor the interfaces, how to look at some graphs and reports. And now we're going to jump over to Log Server. Now, Log Server was designed specifically to collect log data, pretty much any kind of machine-generated log data, and it can even just basically any kind of text-based data can be brought into Log Server and parsed. So syslog, event log, just text entries in a file. And so it's perfect for taking in all that syslog data from network devices. So it acts as a collector. It's going to parse that data and cut it up into fields so that you can easily query and filter and dashboard that information. It also provides the ability to retain that data long-term and to alert on that data. And so if you create a custom query looking for something specific, you can then get an alert on that data. And so in this simple diagram, we've got our Nagios Log Server cluster. We've got our various clustered instances of Log Server here all working together. We have our log sources, which for this presentation would be things like that HP Pro Curve switch. Pushing all that data to Log Server, which then parses it, stores it, and enables us to query it and alert on it. So alerts would be sent out, it'll provide dashboard visualizations, and then can be easily integrated with Nagios XI for alerts, and I'll demonstrate that, so that when Log Server meets certain query criteria, it'll push a passive result back over to XI, where you would see that alert, and it would alert based on all the user logic that you have set up on the Nagios XI side. So we'll just drill down to Log Server real quick here. So here's when we first jump in the interface. We've got quick access to setup guides. We've got our global queries and dashboards, and then our personal queries and dashboards. Dashboards are basically determining how the data looks, the various panels and rows that are in place, how you're going to visualize the data. And then queries are determining exactly what subsets of the data you're going to be seeing. And so what I'll show you next actually is we'll actually log into the interface of that HP Pro Curve, and we will enter our highly secure password. and we'll drill down. Now, each network device is going to be different. I will note that if you go to the network device setup guide, it'll just give you the general information, the IP that you would send that data to, the port that it typically would accept syslog data on, which is 5544, special instructions for Juniper devices. So network device to network device, it's going to vary. But on this ProCurve, for instance, we'd go to our diagnostics section. We'd go to log configuration, and we've got enabled buffered logging enabled. We've got enable syslog enabled, so it is going to actually start logging. We've got the syslog host that it should send to, and then the syslog level. And so this is how we'd set this one up. But like I said, each network device is going to be different. It'll kind of be case by case, and you'll probably be a lot more familiar with your network devices than I would be. But once that's set up, then we jump back over to Log Server, and we would be able to filter for just that particular ProCurve and then kind of look at all the data. And so what I'm going to do is go back to my home menu, and the first place we're going to go is just the Nagios Log Server search dashboard. So this is a dashboard specifically designed for you to just very quickly search for something in particular. So we'll look for that .41, and here we've got a nice chart of new entries for that .41. We've got quite a few different entries down here, and so you can see these are all focused on that host .41, and here are all the fields that were parsed when that data hit. So when the syslog data hit log server, the log stash filter was run on it, a grok filter, to parse all that data so we can expand it, and now we're looking at all of the various fields that were parsed. So we've got useful information like log severity, log type, the actual message, the host that it was focused on, thus enabling us to filter for that particular host. And so what we're going to do is just kind of create a custom dashboard along with a custom alert based on this particular one. So what I'm going to do is actually load the empty dashboard. So we're just going to start right from scratch here. The first thing I'm going to do is add a new row, and we are going to, we'll add a couple of rows here actually. So first we'll add our fields row. This is the one that's going to make it easier for us to query and filter. So we'll create that one. And we'll also make a panels row, but we won't set anything up in that one quite yet. So we'll move fields down below. Once we've created our rows, we will save. So now we've got a couple of empty rows here. First, I'm going to add a panel to my fields row, and we will make this a table and just leave everything set except for span, which I'll make 12 because I know this is going to take up a lot of space. So we'll go ahead and save that. We're going to make this time filter for last 24 hours just to give us a little more of a time frame. And then let's take a look here. Before we do anything else, I'm actually going to create just the simplest of all queries, just looking for that .41. And that we were just getting information from that one. So that'll narrow it down and show us just fields that are involved there. So just so I don't forget which host I'm looking at, I'll click the host checkbox here, and this will show us the IP of everything that's including that .41. And then we will maybe add log severity, log type, and then the message itself might be useful. So you can make these columns anything you want them to be. You can also use these small blue arrows to move them from side to side if you'd like to and kind of rearrange them. But we'll just leave them set up like this. And so now we've got a table, now we've got our fields, and now we can actually look at the messages and look for unique things that we might actually want to query for. So what I'm going to do next before I create an alert for this is I'm going to add a panel to this empty row up here. And so as we look at it, log severity might be an interesting one. And so I'll click on it, and this is actually why I would recommend first making this fields table. So you've got all this data, and you can just click what you want to add to panels and add to queries and filters and just add them really easily. So now that we've done that, we click on log severity. We've got info, warning, and critical. This might make a nice pie chart. So we'll click that. Now we've got this, and we will just drag this up to our other row. We'll go to configure, and we'll just span this down to 4 because it doesn't need nearly as much space as it's got. We'll close this, and now we've got a new panel on our dashboard. Next up, we could look at the log type. That's got some good data. We'll make a bar graph of that. And one thing I'll note, a lot of people run into this, is if you drag this up to the right, because it's spanned out to 12, it's actually not going to populate. What you do is drag it all the way to the left. It'll populate above the other one, and then you can just go back to your configure icon, span that down to 4, and now we've got a couple of panels for this particular one. So now we're looking for just .41. We've got a couple of cool panels. We've got our fields table set up. At this point, I'd probably want to save this dashboard. So I'll save this as the .41 switch dashboard. I can save it as a personal dashboard, meaning only I can see it, or save it as a global dashboard, meaning anybody who logs into the system would have access to it. So we'll make this a global one. I will note too that you can set this as your default dashboard, which when you hit the dashboards menu, this is what you'd see first. And you can export it as a JSON file if you'd actually like to share that with other people. But we'll set this as a global dashboard, have that saved. And so from here on out, we can jump back to home, and we can look at our global dashboards. Here's our .41 switch dashboard, and there we go. We've got a query in place. We've got our dashlets. Now, in terms of setting up something like an alert, you're probably going to want to make a little bit more of a narrow focus. And so that log severity actually looks pretty good. And if I click on that again, maybe I just want to look for critical log severities from this particular switch, or from a group of them. We could also be looking at 100 switches and always send an alert if we get a critical severity level from any of them. But for a simple example, we'll look at critical here. What we can do is either create a filter that means we basically must include critical, so the severity level must be critical, or we can say it must not contain critical. But we'll click the actual spyglass, and then we'll scroll back up, and we can see that now we have a new filter saying the log severity must be critical. And so looking back down, maybe there's some other items that would be of interest here. So you can kind of look through and determine if there's anything else here that you'd actually like to include. So just as a simple example, maybe we could look at PVID mismatch. So we'll copy that. We could add an additional parameter. We'll put it in quotes. Just make sure my capitalization is correct. And so we could really just narrow it down to .41. It's got to be a severity level of critical, and it's got to include PVID mismatch, just as an example. And so that narrows it down to just 2 entries in a very short amount of time. Now, once we've got this in place, I will note, just because a common question is how do I save my queries in Log Server, just click Manage Queries up here. This is also where you would delete queries. So we'll make this one .41 critical SVID. And create it. And so now we've got that one that we can reference anytime, or PVID. And so one thing we can do at this point too is set up any dashboard. And so we could load a completely different dashboard. And so we'll do that real quick. We'll load the empty dashboard, for instance, and then we can load this query on top of it. So they're modular, they're interchangeable. You can drop any query on any dashboard and vice versa. And so here's this one. And so we can export it to a file. We can overwrite this query with your current dashboard query. You can trash it, or if we look on the far left, you can load this query into the current dashboard. And so we load it in there very easily, and that's all we've got to do. So it makes it really easy to overlay these queries and to overlay them onto any dashboard you want to. And as you can see in the dashboards, to create kind of any visualization you want to. Now, one thing I might do actually, I just want to save that as the correct one. That bugs me. There we go. PVID. All right, perfect. Now what we could do is create an alert based on this particular query. And so there's a couple of places you can do that. You can either click the Create an Alert icon on the upper right, once you've got everything in place down here the way you'd like it to, or you can go to Alerting, you can go to New Alert, and so we'll make this one .41 critical PVID. Pick the query that we want to use. There we go. Now in Log Server, the check interval is defining how often we're going to take a look at this. So this is how often Log Server is going to go, hey, do we have anything that matches these criteria, matches this query? The look back period is how far back in the collected log data we're going to look. Now, most of the time these are going to be the same, but there are use cases for them to be different as well. So in this case, we'll leave it the same, but we could check every 5 minutes, but look back over maybe a 15-minute time frame. It's totally up to you to determine how far back in the data you want to go to see if you have a certain number of entries. The thresholds I'll explain real quick. just because they're a little difficult. Not necessarily difficult, but I'll want to explain them clearly. Basically, look at these thresholds like a glass of water. So in Log Server, if my threshold is 4 for warning, that means that the glass is 4 high. If I get 5, the glass would overfill, and then I'd get an alert. So just keep in mind that the actual alert number is going to be 1 higher than your threshold. So if I make my warning 4 and my critical 8, that means at 5 I would get a warning, and at 9 I would get a critical. One thing I'll also note, just because it's another common question, is if you want to alert on the absence of something, if you are expecting certain results and you want to be alerted if they don't appear, then you would just basically make each one of these 1 colon, and you can look at the tooltip here if you forget, and that would mean I'd get an alert if this wasn't present in my data. But we'll leave those at 4 and 8. And the alert methods, we can actually alert right from Log Server. So Log Server can work as a log collection, analysis, and alerting platform all on its own, but more powerfully could be integrated with something like Nagios XI. So using the Nagios Remote Data Processor agent, I can configure Log Server to kick passive results outbound over to my Nagios XI server, and then in Nagios XI I would have centralized alerting and reporting based on everything XI was checking, so the interface bandwidth and the pings of the actual switch. And then I would also have data on all of the stuff Log Server was doing, such as these PVID critical failures. And so it's a really nice way to do it, so you've got everything in one place. They're all working together, and Network Analyzer is the same way, as we'll see shortly. I can also execute a script, just like Nagios XI can execute an event handler. So if you want to take an automated scripted action in response to an alert state detection in XI or in Log Server or in Network Analyzer, that can certainly be done as well. I can also kick out an SNMP trap. Use case there would be maybe you've got a ticketing system that you want to send data to so it can take further action and start creating tickets and alerting people. And like I said, you can also email users right from the system. But in this case, we'll send this one using NRDP. We'd select our NRDP server, and then we'd specify, in this case, we'd specify a host name and a service name. And so this would actually be the host that this check is going to be associated with, which could be that .41. And then the service name would be a special service name for this particular check. And then we determine whether we only want to alert when warning and critical is met. For this one, though, we'll just make it email users. We'll send this one just to Nagios admin, and we'll create our alert. And so from here on out, I can look and I can see the status of this alert. It hasn't had a chance to run, of course, but data would be coming in shortly. I can edit and modify all my alerts here. And so as you can see, it makes it really easy to look for specific things in those log entries. And again, as you can see, there's a lot of data in those log entries. I mean, there's a lot of stuff way beyond just regular bandwidth, as an example. And so this is a really nice way to kind of dig into that data and take advantage of all those pieces of information that are going to be in the logs themselves. So we've looked at XI for monitoring the health of the device itself and the interfaces. We've looked at Log Server for collecting all that syslog data, making use of all that rich information. The next one we look at is Network Analyzer. And so Network Analyzer kind of fills that final piece of the puzzle that XI couldn't cover on its own, which is flow data. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with flow data, but essentially raw bandwidth, if it was a river, raw bandwidth would just be the quantity of water that passed through a dam. Netflow data is going to give you information about what's in the water, what kind of fish are in the water, where did it come from, where's it going to, are there any chemicals in the water? And flow data is exactly like that. You find out where did this particular communication that traversed my network come from, either internally or externally, where did it go to, either internally or externally, what ports did it leverage, how many actual packets were transmitted, how many flows were present in that particular communication. And so it gives you a lot more verbose data on that network traffic. You really get to dig into it. And you can do some cool stuff using flow data. So much like the other two, Network Analyzer would reside on your network. And one thing I will mention is that each of these solutions would be allocated its own server or VM. Especially Network Analyzer and Log Server can be fairly resource intensive. XI certainly can be as well if it's monitoring a lot. But especially Log Server and Network Analyzer, they kind of need their own space. So you'd want your own VMs or physical machines. So Network Analyzer would be another one on your network. It would be collecting all that flow data from flow-enabled network devices, or using clients like fprobe from a Linux machine as an example. So you could get interfaced flow data from a Linux machine using fprobe. And then it collects it all, and then it allows you to do the same thing. You can query that data, you can alert on that data, and fill in that final piece of the puzzle. So we'll jump right into Network Analyzer here. When we first log in, we've got information about our various sources. We've got a summary of all of the alerts. We've also got an abnormal behavior detector, and this is a really cool visualization, kind of like the capacity planning that we saw in Nagios XI. Essentially, this is going to look at how this particular source has performed for the last 30 minutes, and then project what should it do 5 minutes from now based on what it's done in the past. And so it's a really useful tool. We'd see a red rectangle here if there was some abnormal behavior, and it doesn't necessarily mean for certain something bad happened, but it's a pretty good indicator that it's doing something that it normally wouldn't. So it's an aberration from what it would normally do. And so this is a really cool visualization, and then we've got quick access to our various sources. In Network Analyzer, a source is essentially, and we'll just go to create one here real quick, a source is essentially a port that flow data is going to hit Network Analyzer via. You can have multiple network devices feeding into a single source. You would just configure each flow-enabled device to feed to this particular port on Network Analyzer. A lot of the time people like to make each individual device a source. That way you know exactly which device you're looking at. So I could give this one a unique name. So I could make this source named for that particular IP for quick reference. And then if I want to, I can keep a list of the sender IP addresses for quick reference. But of course, if you're naming it based on the device that you're receiving the flows from, that wouldn't really be necessary. And then a specific port. Another thing I'll mention is that if it's Netflow, JFlow, IPFix, pretty much anything except SFlow, when you create the source, you're going to select Netflow. SFlow specifically would have its own space in the dropdown. And then the raw data lifetime, I'll speak to real quick too. Flow data takes up a ton of space. It's very granular data. So you're typically defining a very short time frame for retention of the whole of the raw data. 24 to 48 hours are typical retention time frames. You can work around that for very specific focused items then, using the views capability, which we'll jump to in a little bit. But typically the raw data would be retained for just a very short amount of time, just 24 to 48 hours. Once you've got the source set up, I actually have source 1 already set up. We can click through to it. And this is where we can see some really cool data. So we've got basic bandwidth, we've got flows, we've got packets, we've got bytes a second. If we scroll down and look at our top 5 talkers, we can see the destination IP, the source IP, destination and source ports that talked the most over this time period. And right now we're looking at 24 hours. We could look at 2 days, we could look at last week, but we can look again at bandwidth, flows, packets, bytes a second. And then we get this update. The report runs on raw data, and a week is a little longer than the raw data lifetime, so I won't have complete data for that kind of time period. We've also got a variety of other reports, and there's some built-in reports. All those with an asterisk here would basically would be the ones that are built in. So we've got top 5 talkers by source IP, by destination IP, top 5 talkers by source port, last 24 hours. Just take a quick look at that one. It gives you pie charts. It gives you chord diagrams, and then of course all the table data, and we can click through on the ports for more information. You can also create your own custom reports, and you're basically just saying what time period do I want to look at, what particular source, destination, IP, or port do I want it to be focused on, order it by flows, packets, or bytes, and save it and run the report. We can also overlay things like views, which again I'll talk about in a second, and we can export these as a PDF. So again, this is the visualization portion of looking at this data. We can also do queries, and this is where alerting comes in. And so I've got some queries built in. Common botnets is a really good example. We'll load this query. And so this is basically just a quick query to look to see if we are beaconing out to any known botnets from our network. And so you can see it's just defining particular IPs and ports, more IPs and ports. If we look at this and we see that no query data was returned for your query, that's great. No data, fantastic. We don't want to see any data. But if we did, we'd know we were beaconing out to common botnets. And we've also got some set up for P2P traffic, looking at everything, particular machine on port 8080, web traffic. And so you can set these up very easily and then save them and then quickly access them. Once you set up queries looking for particular occurrences in the flow data, then you can also set up alerts. And so we'll jump over to our alerting tab here. We'll create a new check. And we'll call this our webinar check. We pick the source, so we'll use source 1 here. And then the view, let's say we want to look at just that .41 switch traffic. Moving on to step 2, we can analyze it for bytes, flows, packets, bytes a second. So we'll just put in some arbitrary numbers here. So you're basically just giving it, again, a warning and a critical threshold. And then we're determining where the destination, source, destination, or source, port, IP, or network is or is not something in particular. So we'll just keep our defaults here to keep moving along for time's sake. And we can also add additional statements if you'd like to. So you can make these alerts very complex, looking at some very specific things. And then we'll move on to step 3. And here's where we're in familiar territory. Again, we can email users directly from the system. We can push these over to a Nagios server using NRDP, once again, sending passive results to a centralized XI. So we have centralized visibility, reporting, and alerting. We can kick out an SNMP trap, or we can execute a command. I'll also show you real quick, back in XI, there is an additional report that I waited till the end here to show you. But if you scroll down to the bottom of the available reports section back in Nagios XI, you can look at your network reports. So the charts, the chord diagrams, the table data, just picking them from a drop down here. And you can look at your queries as visualizations inside of XI without actually leaving the XI interface. So that might be useful for you too. Jumping back to Network Analyzer real quick, I just wanted to talk about the views. Now the views are basically a way for you to modify your reports to focus on something more specific, and also to change the retention time frame for particular types of information. And so here, it'll show you the source association. So this is source 1. Our title is .41 switch traffic. I could edit this so that I've got a limiter here in place, looking again at that .5.41 ProCurve switch. I could set it up so the data that actually contains this particular limiter is going to be retained for a much longer time frame. So I could say I want to have 7 days of granular data for anything related to this particular item because this is important on my network. So it gives you a nice way to change that retention time frame and to look at a longer time period for specific subsets of data without burning all the drive space that's on your Network Analyzer server, because like I said, Network Analyzer flow data takes up an awful lot of space. So that's a quick run through of Network Analyzer. And so now we've looked at XI, we've looked at Log Server, we've looked at Network Analyzer. These 3 together are going to give you a very detailed perspective on the health of your network. And not just the network, but also the traffic that's traversing the network. And so it gives you just a really nice detailed view, a nice holistic bird's eye perspective of everything, with the ability to drill down to very minute criteria and determine whether certain things are or aren't happening in your network. So the 3 together give you an awful lot of information, awful lot of angles to look at the health of things from. Wanted to remind you guys that if you do have any other questions, go ahead and type those in. I'm going to hit questions in just a second here. Real quick, I just wanted to talk a little bit about pricing and support options and the free trials. So just real quickly, XI would be licensed based on the number of nodes, so the number of hosts, basically anything with an IP or URL that you're going to be monitoring. And so we've got the 100 node for $19.95 up to the unlimited node for $49.95. There's also the optional Enterprise edition, and one of the features that we looked at for Enterprise would be the capacity planning report, where we projected future usage on that interface. So that would be one of the Enterprise features. Enterprise would be an extra $1,500 on any of these license levels. So our pricing tends to be really competitive compared to other leading solutions. We give you unlimited services, so you can monitor as many services on your host as you want to, and a lot of flexibility there to really monitor whatever's important to you. We also provide a free backup failover and a free testing and development install with each license. So you could have an XI production, you could have a fully licensed activated backup, and you could have a fully licensed activated test dev install somewhere else to do pre-production testing. Log Server is licensed based on the number of instances. So for $19.95, you can have a single instance cluster. For a few thousand more, you can have a 2-instance cluster. And I guess I should backtrack a little bit. 1 instance wouldn't be a cluster, but you could have a single instance of Log Server running. For a few thousand more, you'd have a 2-instance cluster, and then you've got load balancing and redundancy of the data. So if one dies, you've still got all of your shards. The breakdown of the daily indexes on another machine. There's also the 3-instance license for 1,000 more, and after this point, after 2, it's either $1,000 or less per additional instance, all the way up to 20 instances, and we can put together larger packages for you too. And the Network Analyzer by itself is only $995. Bundled with other solutions, it's $795, so a really good value. And that's for unlimited sources, as much as you can get that system to handle. There's also a fully functional 60-day trial of all of these solutions. And we'll just jump over to Nagios.com real quick here. And the easiest way to get to the list is just to click on the products dropdown. And you'll notice a Download Now button underneath each solution. So you could spin up a free trial of each of these. They're all available as a OVF template for VMware. Just a real quick and easy way to get started in Player or Workstation or ESX, vSphere. So really quick and easy way to get running there. Those are running CentOS 6.7 under the hood. And there's also a source installer for RHEL or CentOS. And XI's actually got a virtual PC option, which you could make work in Microsoft Virtual Server, Virtual PC, or Hyper-V. And so you can do a source install, you can run the VMs, and you can kind of work on putting them all together. We've also got the support forum. That's support.nagios.com/forum. And there you can register a username. You can post in the general support section for direct help from the same techs you'd work with as a licensed client. And I also wanted to show you real quick the KB. This is the Nagios Knowledge Base. And this is a place where you can get information, find technical articles, documentation links, tutorials on all of our solutions. So there's hundreds of articles here. That could be a really good resource. And we can also offer you a free quick start remote session. And so if you wanted a remote session, some live hands-on help from a support tech, that's something we can offer you as well at no charge to help you get started. If you need anything else, go ahead and email us at sales@nagios.com. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to help you out, learn more about your requirements, and answer your questions. Otherwise, like I said, thanks so much for joining me today. Hopefully it was constructive for you, and we'll look forward to hearing from you soon. Have a great rest of the week, everybody.